This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I am Shekhar Gupta and my guest this week, Professor Michael Spence, Nobel laureate for economics 2001,
Fun to be with you.
chairman of the Growth Commission, but more than that, a global spokesman for economic growth, professor at Stanford University.
Right.
India is a tough place to be in for the global spokesman for growth because growth's getting a bad name in this place.
Oh, really? Is that because it's not inclusive enough? Is it
Well,
because
that is one of the charges,
Yeah.
but also because of high inflation right now.
Yeah.
It's often the debate is growth versus inflation.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. I mean, in fact, the high growth in the developing world has increased demand pressure on commodity prices, oil, gas, minerals, and now we see, in part, although there are other causes, food. So it's understandable that people are reluctant about this. In addition, in high growth mode, you know, there's a lot of jobs that are created and a lot of other jobs that are destroyed. And this creates anxiety and it creates a challenge for the government to move in and protect people while allowing the economic process to occur.
I'm interested in what you said when I said growth has got bad name here.
Yeah.
You said, why is it not inclusive enough? How do you define inclusive growth? I've speed read your report.
Yeah.
You talk about the need for inclusiveness,
Yeah.
good governance, good leadership,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you define inclusive growth?
Well, it's an intertemporal context in the context of growth. I mean, you know, what people fundamentally have to believe is that the sacrifices that are made now are going to make their children and grandchildren better off. And that means no group is excluded just by virtue of who they are, whether it's religion, ethnicity, or anything else. It means that people are going to be protected through these economic transitions. And finally, it means that the government is not going to let the income distribution get too unequal.
But that has happened because we have the phenomenon of what I call as pink paper triumphalism, where we have some financial papers who every third day have lists of how many more billionaires India has produced,
Yeah.
how many more Bentleys have been sold,
Yeah.
and that unleashes
Right. I understand.
sort of counter forces of greed and
Yeah.
envy.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that happens in many places. It's a problem in China. It's a problem in the United States, where most of the increased income has gone to the upper end of the income distribution. And if you don't find a way to rearrange the benefits, either through income or for the delivery of services, then people will say, why should I support this? It's perfectly reasonable. It's an important part of growth strategy, is to make sure that people share in the benefits.
You mentioned, say, 13 countries which have done well
Yes.
in terms of growth around the world.
Yep.
Give us your take on India.
India is about to join that group. I mean, it's just a matter of time. India is growing at 9%
For
plus.
3 years now, yes.
Yeah, but before that it accelerated.
Right.
You know, we could probably count up the number of years, but unless something goes badly wrong, India and Vietnam are going to be among the sustained high growth cases, even with the standard of 7% a year average growth.
Two very different countries and societies.
Yeah,
and two very different political systems.
Very different. I mean, it really illustrates the point that you can't map the form of government onto the results. If the government is well-intentioned in a democratic context, it will work, and it will, by the way, survive changes in government and political party. I mean, once the momentum starts, it's pretty hard to reverse.
Because there are two things in your report. One, where you talk about the need for good governance,
Yeah.
good politics.
Yeah.
But at another, you talk about how growth has been good in several countries which have one-party rule, and ruled by a party which is also sure of being in power for a long time. That's not happened in India for a long time, and will
No.
not happen maybe in the next 30 years.
Yeah, that's okay. That's not a problem for growth in India. I mean, India is going to be the largest democracy that has achieved and sustained high growth, and that'll be an important example to many other countries.
The reason I'm coming back to this question all the time is that
Yeah.
we have elections coming up.
Yes, you do.
And growth has become an election issue in a way, partly because of the ruling formulation's inability to sell the idea of growth, and partly because its opponents have sort of seized on it as the factor underlying inflation. In fact, the left, which supports this government, says that this is a GDP-obsessed government and has ignored inflation.
Oh, I see. That's very interesting. You see, I think I would have thought that inflation, the core cause of inflation is in the global economy and not a domestic phenomenon. It's very difficult to deal with it for a central bank because the relative prices are changing so fast as a result of the commodity price increases, and that produces naturally a kind of inflationary pressure everywhere.
So what are the good things a government like India could do to fight inflation while sustaining growth?
Well, sometimes to fight inflation, you have to pay a price in the short run with respect to growth. There are many examples of that.
Is that an acceptable price? Will you accept it?
Yes. Inflation is lethal with respect to growth if it gets out of hand. So it has to be a high priority to deal with it, even if dealing with it requires a certain amount of negative pressure on the kind of growth engine in the economy. You just can't have your cake and eat it too all the time.
So what would you do in India then to control inflation, which is a priority now?
Basically, the formula that's been worked out over time is the central bank using money supply and interest rate instruments basically prevents the inflation from spreading and occurring. And then the governor of the central bank of the European Central Bank was asked the other day at a meeting I was at, well, then how do you accommodate the relative price change? And he said, you have to do it over time, right? So what happens basically is that those prices go up. That means other ones sort of have to go down, but they don't go down. So slowly you get back into equilibrium.
There's a suggestion in India that interest rates are still already quite high. So why not address it by letting the rupee strengthen?
You could, but then
Because we are big net importers.
Yes, you are, but if you let it strengthen too much, these are hard problems. These are things where there's no formula, and people use judgments and have differences of opinion. But if you let the rupee exchange appreciate too much to the extent that new arrivals in the export sector and manufacturing become uncompetitive,
right,
you can unnecessarily slow the growth. So there's a balance.
So you have to balance it.
You do have to balance.
But central bankers have to play a role.
They have to play an important role.
More than politicians?
No, not more than politicians, but they have an important role to play.
The reason I'm asking you this is that there's been a lot of pressure in the political system to take administrative measures to control prices, which is export controls.
Yeah.
We've done that already in the case of food grains.
Yeah.
Ban on futures trading.
Yeah.
Some of that has been done, although in marginal commodities.
Right.
But now there are more radical ideas like cement and steel being put under price controls using really tough laws.
Yeah. I mean, except as temporary emergency measures, as in the case of food, where you have poor people who are threatened with at least malnutrition, if not worse.
Right.
It's a bad idea to intervene in the price system and start making a habit of it.
Right.
There's a very widespread pattern of energy subsidization in the developing world. It's just a bad idea. It's a regressive subsidy. It affects the more well-to-do more than the poor.
And it's a subsidy to the rich.
It's a subsidy to the rich. It's a subsidy to the people who fly in airplanes. It's just
or drive Bentleys.
Right, or drive Bentleys. It doesn't provide incentives for energy efficiency. It prevents the economy from lining up behind the climate change agenda in the future. I mean, just everything about it
because
is
if
a bad
you
idea.
spend any time in India, you can't escape this debate on fuel prices.
Right. Now, nobody's naive. If you've had subsidies for a long period of time, the proposal is not to take them away overnight. I mean, things have to be done gradually, and it's politically difficult, and one has to restore the benefits in another form with respect to the less well-to-do members of society. So it's not just a one-off thing, but long-term big subsidies to energy prices are things that are well worth getting rid of.
But you don't mind a selective application of this, as you said, in trying to maybe if you let prices of fuel rise, you find a way of compensating the poor?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, Indonesia just announced a plan over time to remove the energy subsidies and give the resources that will then come to the government that were formerly implicitly being spent on the subsidies to the poor to help them afford food.
And how would they do it?
Well, I mean, when you subsidize energy, you're basically giving up a government tax that could be either invested in education or infrastructure or used for income redistribution. That's basically what's going on. I mean, it's as if, it's a little hard to describe kind of very briefly, but in effect, what's being given up is government revenues.
Right.
I mean, you know, the private sector is selling it at thus and so. If the government took that, the difference between that and the global price in tax, it can either give it back to the consumers in tax or spend it on something, you know, in the form of a subsidy, or spend it on something else. The proposal is there's better things to spend it on.